In the ancient courtyard of Winterfell, where the old gods still whisper through the heart tree, and the stone remembers 8,000 years of northern blood, an old warrior raises his sword one final time. His hands are bound, his white whiskers are matted with blood, and before him stands the boy he once trained. But this is no ordinary execution. This is the moment when loyalty meets betrayal, when honor faces treachery, when a teacher must look into the eyes of his student and see only darkness staring back. The blade falls once, twice, 3 times, each stroke more desperate than the last. The iron-born prince who conquered Winterfell cannot even grant his former master a clean death. And in those terrible final moments, with the courtyard watching in horror and the gods themselves turning away, one question burns through the cold northern air. How did it come to this? Who was Sir Rodrik Cassel, the gruff master-at-arms who trained the wolves of Winterfell, the loyal guardian who stood watch over the Stark children for decades, the weathered warrior whose brother died at the Tower of Joy alongside the greatest knights in Westeros? What path led this faithful servant from the training yards of peace to the blood-soaked stones of betrayal? Tonight we uncover the complete story of Rodrik Cassel, from the fires of Robert's rebellion to the burning of Winterfell itself, from teaching young Robb and Jon their first sword strokes to facing Theon Greyjoy across castle walls. This is a tale of unwavering devotion in an age of broken oaths, of northern honor in a world gone mad with ambition, of the cost paid by those who serve with their whole hearts in a game where mercy is for fools and loyalty is rewarded with death. Now, before we begin, I need to share something with you. Did you know that 84% of the people watching these videos right now have not yet subscribed? If you are enjoying these deep dives into the lore and untold stories of Westeros, please take just a moment to hit that subscribe button. It truly helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these detailed character explorations that the major channels often overlook. And I genuinely love hearing from all of you scattered across the world. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the realm. Your stories about when and where you watch have become as much a part of this journey as the tales themselves. So now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound. Get comfortable under your blanket and let us ease into tonight's tale together. The story of Rodrik Cassel, Winterfell's faithful guardian, the North's forgotten hero. To understand Rodrik Cassel, we must first understand the world he served. For 8,000 years, Winterfell has stood as the beating heart of the North. Built by Brandon the Builder in the Age of Heroes, its walls have witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the coming of White Walkers, and the bending of the knee to Southern kings. Generation after generation, House Stark has ruled from this ancient fortress, and generation after generation, loyal bannermen have stood beside them. Among these faithful houses, few have served longer or bled more freely than House Cassel, a smaller noble family sworn to the Starks. The Cassels made their purpose clear through centuries of unwavering devotion. They did not seek glory or gold. They sought only to serve, to protect, to stand watch while others slept. And in the world of Westeros, where oaths break like thin ice and loyalty lasts only as long as it profits, such dedication was rarer than Valyrian steel. Into this tradition of service, Rodrik Cassel was born. The histories do not record the exact year, but we know he came of age during the reign of Lord Rickard Stark, in the twilight years before Robert's rebellion shattered the peace of the Seven Kingdoms. By the time our story truly begins, Rodrik has become a man shaped by war and tempered by loss. His face is weathered like old leather. His white whiskers frame a mouth that has forgotten how to smile easily. Scars map the stories of battles across his arms and hands. This is not a man who lived gently. But those who knew Rodrik understood that beneath the gruff exterior and the stern commands beat the heart of a true guardian. As Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, he held one of the most crucial positions in any great house. He was responsible for training not just the household guard, but the noble children themselves. Every morning, young lords and common soldiers alike would gather in the training yard to learn the art of the blade under his watchful eye. He taught them how to hold a sword, yes, but more importantly, he taught them how to hold honor. Rodrik's family connections ran deep into Winterfell's history. His brother Martin Cassel had ridden south with Lord Eddard Stark during Robert's rebellion and never returned, dying at a place called the Tower of Joy, alongside some of the finest knights the realm had ever known. His nephew Jory would later serve as captain of Lord Eddard's household guard. The Cassels gave everything to House Stark, their swords, their blood, their lives. And as we shall see, Rodrik Cassel would prove no exception to this tradition. When our tale begins in earnest, it is the year 298 after Aegon's conquest. King Robert Baratheon sits the Iron Throne, and the realm has known relative peace for nearly 2 decades. In Winterfell, all the Stark children still draw breath under the same roof. Robb and Jon spar in the yard. Bran climbs walls with reckless abandon. Arya sneaks away from her needlework lessons. Sansa dreams of southern nights and songs. Even baby Rickon toddles through the halls under watchful eyes. It is the calm before the storm. The last golden autumn before winter comes, and standing guard through it all, training the next generation of northern warriors, walking the walls with the same dedication his family has shown for generations, is Sero Rodrik Cassel, Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, trusted advisor to Lord Eddard Stark, living guardian of northern martial tradition. He does not yet know that within a single turn of the seasons, almost everything he has sworn to protect will be ripped away, that the children he trains will be scattered to the winds, that the castle he guards will fall to the very boy he taught to fight, that his own death will come not from wildlings or southern invaders, but from the treachery of fellow northerners. But for now, in this moment of peace, Rodrik Cassel stands in the training yard of Winterfell, watching his charges practice their forms, and believes that duty and loyalty still matter in this world. That honor is more than just a word carved on ancient stones. He believes, as his father believed, and his brother believed, that some things are worth dying for. And the gods help him. He is right. Every great warrior begins as a boy holding a wooden sword too heavy for his small hands. Rodrik Cassel was no different. Born into House Cassel during the reign of Lord Rickard Stark, he entered a world where service to the Starks was not merely duty but destiny woven into the very fabric of his family's existence. His father before him had served. His grandfather before that. The Cassels did not question this path. They walked it with pride. Young Rodrik trained alongside his brother Martin in the ways of sword and shield, of horse and honor. The two boys were inseparable in those early years, sparring in courtyards, competing for their father's approval, dreaming of the day they would stand as true knights in service to Winterfell. Martin was the quicker of the two, blessed with natural grace and a smile that came easily. Rodrik was steadier, more methodical, the kind of fighter who wore opponents down through sheer determination and technique, perfected through endless repetition. Both brothers took their vows to House Stark in their youth, swearing the ancient oaths that bound lesser houses to greater ones. They stood in Winterfell's Godswood beneath the watching face carved into the heart tree and pledged their swords, their lives, everything they were and would ever be. The old gods witnessed their words. The wolves of Winterfell accepted their service. During these years of peace, Rodrik found himself training in the same yards as Lord Rickard's sons. Brandon Stark, the eldest, was fire and fury personified, a warrior born with natural talent that seemed almost unfair. Eddard, the younger brother, was quieter but no less capable, approaching combat with careful thought rather than raw aggression. Rodrik watched both men grow from boys into legends, and in watching them, he learned what true northern leadership looked like. The North in those days felt eternal, unchanging. Winter would come and go, as it always had. The Starks would rule as they always had, and houses like the Cassels would serve as they always had. It seemed as natural as the turning of seasons. Then Lyanna Stark was taken. The history books call it a kidnapping. The songs call it an abduction. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, rode off with Lord Rickard's only daughter, and the realm would never be the same. When Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding justice, the Mad King Aerys had him arrested. When Lord Rickard came to plead for his son's life, Aerys burned him alive while forcing Brandon to watch. The North's great lord and his heir murdered in the capital they had trusted. Robert's rebellion exploded across Westeros like wildfire through a dry forest. Robert Baratheon, who had been betrothed to Lyanna, rose in fury. Eddard Stark, now Lord of Winterfell, far sooner than any man should have to be, called his banners. And when the northern armies marched south to war, Rodrik and Martin Cassel rode with them. For Rodrik, war was everything the songs had promised, and nothing like them at all. There was glory, yes, in standing beside your brothers with sword in hand. There was pride in fighting for a just cause against a mad tyrant. But there was also the smell of burning flesh, the screams of dying horses, the weight of a blade cutting through armor and into meat. War was mud and blood, and watching friends fall beside you, knowing you could do nothing but keep fighting. The rebellion raged for more than a year. Rodrik fought in battles whose names would echo through history. He stood in shield walls. He charged across fields slick with rain and blood. He learned that survival in combat was not about being the strongest or the fastest, but about being smart enough to see the blade coming and disciplined enough to respond correctly, even when terror gripped your heart. And then came the Tower of Joy. After Robert's rebellion ended with the Mad King dead and Robert crowned, after the siege of Storm's End was lifted and the Targaryen fleet scattered, there remained one final mystery. Lyanna Stark was not in King's Landing. She was not anywhere anyone expected. Eddard Stark, following whispers and clues, took 6 companions and rode to a tower in the Mountains of Dawn. Among those 6 rode Martin Cassel. Rodrik never saw his brother again. The stories that filtered back were confused, contradictory, wrapped in the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. 3 knights of the Kingsguard had been at that tower. 3 of the greatest warriors the realm had ever produced, including Ser Arthur Dayne himself, the Sword of the Morning. 7 men went in. Only 2 came out. Eddard Stark and Howland Reed survived. Lord Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Cassel, Theo Wool, and Ser Arthur Dayne did not. When word reached Rodrik that his brother had fallen, something hardened inside him. Martin had been the better swordsman, the more naturally gifted warrior. If the gods could take him, they could take anyone. There was no fairness in combat, no justice in death. You served, you fought, and sometimes you died far from home in a tower no one had heard of for reasons you would never fully understand. The North returned home changed. Lord Eddard came back with his sister's bones and a bastard son no one had expected. Robert took the throne. The rebellion was won, but the cost had been devastating. House Stark had lost a father, a brother, and a sister. House Cassel had lost Martin, so many northern families returned with empty seats at their tables. In the aftermath, as Winterfell began to heal and rebuild, as baby Jon Snow was settled into the castle, despite Lady Catelyn's obvious displeasure, as the new order of the realm slowly took shape, Rodrik threw himself into service with renewed dedication. His brother had died serving House Stark. Very well, then Rodrik would serve twice as hard, carry Martin's memory forward through his own actions. He had survived Robert's rebellion. He had seen the cost of broken oaths and mad kings, and now in the peace that followed he would help forge the next generation of northern warriors. He would teach them not just how to fight, but why to fight. He would pass on the lessons written in his brother's blood. The gods had taken Martin at the Tower of Joy. They would not find Rodrik wanting when his own moment came. In the years following Robert's rebellion, as the realm settled into an uneasy peace and King Robert grew fat on wine while his wife plotted in the shadows, Winterfell became what it had always been, a place of refuge, a fortress against the darkness beyond the wall, a home to the oldest bloodline in Westeros, and Rodrik Cassel became its master-at-arms. The position was not given lightly. Master-at-arms in a great house carried responsibilities that went far beyond teaching men where to place their feet during a sword fight. You became the keeper of martial tradition, the guardian of skills that might someday mean the difference between survival and extinction. In the north particularly, where threats came not just from ambitious lords but from wildlings, from winter itself, from things that walked in the darkness beyond human understanding, the master-at-arms served as the castle's bulwark against chaos. Rodrik earned the role through decades of faithful service, through blood spilled in Robert's rebellion, through the quiet competence that marked everything he did. Lord Eddard, who had seen Rodrik fight beside his father and brother, who had watched him weather loss with stoic determination, knew that Winterfell's training yards could be in no better hands. The responsibility consumed Rodrik's days from dawn until long after sunset. Each morning, before the castle fully woke, he would be in the courtyard, inspecting weapons, checking the condition of practice swords, ensuring everything was ready for the day's training. He knew every blade in Winterfell's armory, could tell you which ones held their edge best, which needed rewriting, which were suitable for green boys, and which should only be trusted to experienced hands. When the sun finally crested the horizon and spread pale light across Winterfell's ancient stones, the real work began. Guards arrived for drills, household soldiers practiced formations, young men from lesser northern houses, sent to Winterfell to learn the warrior's trade, gathered nervously for their first lessons. And Rodrik moved among them, all like a general surveying his troops, correcting stances, demonstrating techniques, pushing each man to reach just beyond what he thought himself capable of achieving. His teaching style was not gentle. The North did not breed gentle men, and Rodrik understood that coddling students in the training yard would only get them killed when real steel came calling. He barked commands. He criticized mistakes without mercy. He made boys run laps around the castle walls until their legs burned and their lungs screamed for air. But underneath the gruffness lived genuine care. He remembered every student's name, every weakness, every small improvement. When a boy finally mastered a technique that had eluded him for weeks, Rodrik's brief nod of approval meant more than a feast day's worth of praise from softer teachers. Beyond the training itself, Rodrik managed Winterfell's entire garrison. He organized patrol schedules, ensuring the walls were always properly manned. He maintained discipline among the guards, dealing swiftly with any man who drank too much on duty or shirked his responsibilities. He coordinated with the castle's steward on matters of supply, making certain there were always enough weapons, enough armor, enough arrows in reserve should crisis come calling. The other members of Winterfell's household came to rely on him as much as Lord Eddard did. Maester Luwin would consult with Rodrik on matters of castle defense, understanding that the old warrior knew Winterfell's strengths and weaknesses better than anyone. Septa Mordain, tasked with teaching the Stark daughters proper ladylike behavior, would sometimes watch the training yard with a mixture of disapproval and secret admiration. Even old Nan, who had seen generations come and go, treated Rodrik with respect reserved for those who truly understood what it meant to serve. But it was with Lord Eddard himself that Rodrik formed his deepest bond. The two men had come up together, had fought in the same war, had lost people they loved to the same conflicts. Ned trusted Rodrik's judgment on military matters, absolutely, when decisions needed to be made about northern defenses, about which families to call upon for men, about how to respond to threats from wildlings or rival houses. Ned sought Rodrik's counsel and listened carefully to his answers. Their conversations often stretched late into the night in Lord Eddard's solar, two veterans speaking the language only soldiers truly understand. They discussed not just tactics and strategy, but the weight of command, the burden of sending men to their deaths, the impossible balance between protecting your people and knowing you cannot save everyone. Rodrik never presumed to be Ned's equal in rank, but in those private moments they were simply two northern men trying to do right by their responsibilities. Rodrik's philosophy of training was brutally simple. Honor before victory, but victory when it mattered. The North fought differently than the South. Southern knights loved their tournaments and their elaborate codes of chivalry, their pretty armor and their songs of glory. Northern warriors understood that combat was about survival, not spectacle. You used whatever worked. You fought to win because losing meant dying, and dying meant leaving your family unprotected. He taught his students to fight dirty when necessary, to exploit every advantage, to understand that a fair fight was a luxury you could not afford when wildlings came over the wall, or when winter descended and food grew scarce and desperate men did desperate things. But he also taught them discipline, that rage without control was just another way to die, that true strength came from knowing exactly what you could do and doing it with absolute precision. The peaceful years stretched on. One season became another. Boys grew into men under Rodrik's watchful eye, then left Winterfell to serve their own houses, carrying his lessons with them. The garrison rotated as soldiers aged out or moved on, but the training remained constant. Day after day, year after year, Rodrik stood in that courtyard and forged warriors from raw material. He was getting older now. His hair had gone completely white. His joints ached on cold mornings. The scars from Robert's rebellion sometimes troubled him when the weather changed, but his sword arm remained steady. His eye keen, his mind sharp, he had become as permanent a feature of Winterfell as the castle walls themselves. The realm was changing around him, though. King Robert's marriage to Cersei Lannister was poisonous. Rumors filtered north of corruption in King's Landing, of tension between powerful houses, of debts and schemes, and dangerous games being played by people who thought themselves untouchable. Rodrik heard these whispers and felt old instincts stirring. He had seen what happened when the realm's peace shattered. He had watched Robert's rebellion tear through Westeros like a storm. But for now, in Winterfell, there was still order, still purpose, still the simple dignity of doing your duty day after day without complaint or expectation of reward, beyond knowing you had served faithfully. Rodrik Cassel stood watch, and the North remained strong. Of all the responsibilities that fell to Rodrik Cassel as Master-at-Arms, none mattered more than training the Stark children themselves. Common soldiers could be replaced. Garrison guards came and went. But the young wolves of Winterfell, the next generation of House Stark, they would shape the future of the entire North. Every lesson Rodrik taught them, every correction he made, every value he instilled would ripple outward through history in ways impossible to predict. Robb Stark was the first to truly capture Rodrik's attention and, though he would never admit it aloud, a measure of his pride. The boy who would be Lord of Winterfell showed promise from his earliest days in the training yard. He possessed natural athleticism, the kind of physical grace that made complex movements look effortless. But more than that, Robb had something harder to teach: leadership. Even as a child, other boys looked to him for guidance. When Robb spoke, they listened. When he organized mock battles during practice sessions, Everyone wanted to fight beside him rather than against him. Rodrik worked with Rob differently than he did other students. The heir to Winterfell needed to learn not just how to fight but how to command, how to assess a battlefield and make decisions that would send men to their deaths, how to inspire loyalty while maintaining the distance that authority required. These were subtle lessons, woven between sword strokes and tactical discussions. Rodrik watched Rob absorb them like a sponge, saw him grow from an eager boy into a young man who understood that being lord meant more than giving orders. It meant bearing the weight of every soul under your protection. Jon Snow trained alongside Rob, and if anything, the bastard boy worked even harder than his true-born brother. Jon carried a chip on his shoulder the size of the wall itself. Being born a Snow rather than a Stark meant proving himself constantly, being twice as good to earn half the recognition. Rodrik saw this hunger in him, this desperate need to be worthy, and he used it, not cruelly, but purposefully. Where Rob fought with natural confidence, Jon fought with calculated precision. He studied every opponent, learned from every mistake, practiced techniques long after others had gone inside for supper. His swordsmanship developed a different character than Rob's, more technical, more efficient, less flash, more substance. Rodrik recognized the iron will beneath Jon's quiet exterior, and knew that this boy, bastard or not, would become something formidable if the world gave him half a chance. What surprised Rodrik most was how he found himself treating Jon with the same respect he showed Rob. The boy's birth was not his fault. His dedication could not be questioned, and there was something about Jon Snow that reminded Rodrik of Lord Eddard himself, that same quiet honor, that same unwillingness to compromise on matters of principle even when it cost him. In another world, with a different mother, Jon might have been remarkable without the weight of bastardy crushing down on him. As it was, he would have to become remarkable despite it. Then there was Theon Greyjoy, and here Rodrik's feelings grew more complicated. The Ironborn prince had come to Winterfell as Lord Eddard's ward after his father's failed rebellion, which was a pretty word for hostage. Theon was meant to ensure Balon Greyjoy's good behavior, a living guarantee held in a gilded cage. The boy had been young enough when he arrived that Winterfell became his home, but never quite home enough that he forgot where he truly came from. The Theon possessed genuine skill, particularly with a bow. His archery was exceptional, honed by the same Ironborn tradition that made raiders into legends. But there was something in him that troubled Rodrik, a cockiness that crossed over into arrogance, a need to prove himself that manifested not as Jon's quiet determination, but as loud boasting and casual cruelty toward those he perceived as beneath him. He mocked the other boys when they struggled. He flirted with serving girls in ways that made Rodrik's jaw tighten. He played at being a Stark, while nursing dreams of returning to the Iron Islands as a conquering hero. Still, Rodrik trained him faithfully because Lord Eddard had commanded it, and because even a hostage prince deserved to learn how to defend himself. He taught Theon the same techniques he taught everyone else, corrected his form, pushed him to improve. But he watched Theon more carefully than the others, saw the conflict brewing inside this boy torn between two families, two cultures, two destinies. And some nights, lying in his quarters after a long day, Rodrik wondered what would become of Theon Greyjoy when the careful balance of his situation inevitably collapsed. Young Bran Stark presented an entirely different challenge. The boy had little interest in swordplay. Oh, he attended lessons because his father required it, and he tried his best when Rodrik's eye was upon him. But Bran's heart lived elsewhere, up on the walls, scaling towers, climbing anywhere and everywhere his mother had forbidden him from climbing. The child moved through vertical spaces like a spider, fearless and quick, and no amount of discipline seemed capable of keeping his feet on the ground. Rodrik found himself feeling a particular fondness for this restless boy, who reminded him that not every Stark was destined for conventional glory. Bersain had a dreamer's soul trapped in a world that demanded warriors. When he did focus on his lessons, he showed surprising insight into tactics and strategy, understanding movements on a theoretical level, even if his body refused to cooperate with the practical application. Rodrik was patient with him in ways he rarely was with others, recognizing that some students needed different paths to the same destination. Together, these boys formed something greater than the sum of their parts. Competition bred excellence. Rob and John pushed each other to greater heights through their rivalry and brotherhood. The man's skill forced the others to work harder. Even Bran's presence reminded them that strength came in many forms. The training yard became their proving ground, the place where they tested themselves against each other and against Rodrik's exacting standards. Rodrik watched them grow from children into young men and felt the satisfaction of work well done. He was forging the future of the North one lesson at a time, teaching them not just the mechanics of combat, but the values that should guide a warrior's hand: honor, duty, loyalty to those who depended on you, protection of the weak, justice tempered with mercy. He could not know that these boys he trained with such care would soon be scattered to the corners of Westeros, that Rob would become a king, that John would take the black, that Theon would betray everything Rodrik tried to teach him, that Bran would fall and fly and become something beyond human understanding. For now, they were simply his students, the next generation of wolves, and Rodrik Cassel taught them everything he knew. The Raven arrived on black wings, carrying news that would shatter the peace Winterfell had known for 17 years. King Robert Baratheon was coming north. The man who had won the throne through rebellion, who had been Ned Stark's closest friend and brother in all but blood, was making the long journey from King's Landing to the frozen north. And everyone who understood anything about politics knew that kings did not travel such distances for pleasure. When the royal party finally arrived, it seemed half the realm had come with them. The Kingsguard in their white cloaks, Queen Cersei and her golden Lannister children, servants and courtiers, and knights beyond counting. They brought southern excess to northern simplicity, and the contrast could not have been starker. Rodrik watched it all with the wary eye of a man who had seen what happened when the court came calling. The feast that night was grand by northern standards, though surely modest compared to what these southerners were accustomed to. Robert and Ned embraced like the brothers they had once been, though both men were older now, worn by the years in different ways. Robert had grown fat on wine and rich food, his warrior's body buried under layers of indulgence. Ned remained lean and hard, shaped by northern winters and northern responsibilities. They laughed together, remembering battles and shared youth. But even their laughter could not hide the distance that time and power had carved between them. Rodrik knew before the words were spoken what Robert had come to ask. The king needed a new hand. Jon Arryn, who had raised both Robert and Ned as wards, who had been the glue holding the realm together, was dead. And Robert wanted his old friend to come south, to help him rule, to stand beside him as he had during the rebellion all those years ago. Ned did not want to go. That much was obvious to anyone who knew him. The hand of the king was a poisoned position, requiring you to navigate treacherous political waters that had drowned better men than Eddard Stark. But Robert was his king and his friend, and when a king asks, refusal becomes almost impossible. Duty called, honor demanded, and so Ned would go south, taking his daughters with him, leaving Winterfell in the hands of Robb and Rodrik and Maester Luwin. Then came the morning that changed everything. Bran fell. The details were confused at first. The boy had been climbing again, despite every warning, despite every punishment, scaling towers like he was born with wings instead of legs. And somehow, someway, he had fallen from a high window and now lay broken and unmoving in his bed. Lady Catelyn kept vigil beside him, refusing to eat or sleep, her eyes hollow with grief and terror. The castle held its breath, waiting to see if the boy would live or die. Rodrik felt the loss personally. He had trained that restless child, had watched him struggle with sword forms while dreaming of heights. Now those dreams had betrayed him, and Bran lay caught between life and death while his mother's heart broke beside him. But worse was yet to come. An assassin came in the night, a catspaw with a Valyrian steel dagger, sent to finish what the fall had started. Lady Catelyn fought him off with her bare hands, her fingers sliced to the bone as she grappled with the blade meant for her son's throat. Summer, Bran's direwolf, tore the man apart before he could complete his mission. But the attempt itself told a story more terrifying than the violence. Someone wanted Bran Stark dead. Someone had sent a killer into Winterfell itself to murder a sleeping child. The dagger became evidence. Valyrian steel was rare, worth a small fortune, not the kind of weapon you gave a common cutthroat unless you had gold to burn. Lady Catelyn, driven by a mother's fury and a growing sense that her family stood at the center of a conspiracy larger than any of them understood, made a decision that would alter the course of history. She would go south. She would find Ned. She would warn him that something rotten festered in the realm, that their children were in danger, that the shadows held knives. And she would take Rodrik with her. The order came as both honor and burden. Rodrik understood why Lady Catelyn chose him. He was her husband's most trusted man-at-arms, a veteran of Robert's rebellion, capable in a fight and loyal beyond question. But leaving Winterfell felt like abandoning his post. The castle's defenses would fall to others. The training yard would need a new master, at least temporarily. Everything he had built would continue without him. Still, duty called. Lady Stark needed protection on a journey that might well end in violence. So Rodrik gathered his gear, sharpened his sword, and prepared to ride south for the first time since the rebellion had ended all those years ago. They traveled quickly and quietly, avoiding the main roads where possible. Lady Catelyn wore common clothes and kept her face hidden. Rodrik rode beside her, eyes constantly scanning for threats, hand never far from his sword hilt. The journey gave them time to talk, long conversations about the danger facing House Stark, about the dagger and what it might mean, about who could want Bran dead and why. Rodrik's soldiers' instincts told him they were walking into something far larger than a simple assassination attempt. The pieces did not fit cleanly. A Valyrian steel dagger used by a common criminal. A murder attempt on a crippled child. The timing so close to the king's visit. Something moved beneath the surface of events. Something with teeth and plans that spread beyond what they could yet see. King's Landing struck Rodrik like a physical blow when they finally arrived. The stench hit you first. 500,000 people packed into a city that should hold half that number. Waste ran through the streets. The air tasted of rot and desperation. The buildings crowded together like drunken men, leaning on each other for support. After Winterfell's clean stone and honest northern simplicity, the capital felt diseased. They found Ned in the Tower of the Hand, surrounded by the trappings of power, but looking more trapped than elevated. When Rodrik and Lady Catelyn told him about the assassination attempt, about the dagger, about their journey south, Ned's face grew grave. He was beginning to understand, as they all were, that something dark was unfolding around House Stark. Petyr Baelish, called Littlefinger, claimed to recognize the dagger, said it had belonged to him once. Said he lost it in a bet to Tyrion Lannister. The claim seemed plausible enough, backed by Baelish's reputation as master of coin and his supposed friendship with Lady Catelyn from their youth. But Rodrik, watching the man spin his tale, felt something cold settle in his gut. This smiling lord with his neat beard and his clever words, something about him did not ring true. They had come south, seeking answers. Instead, they had found only deeper mysteries. and the game, whatever game was being played, had pieces moving on boards they could not yet see. The north seemed very far away. The investigation into the Valyrian steel dagger led down paths that twisted like the streets of King's Landing itself. Rodrik accompanied Lady Catelyn as they tried to trace the weapon's origin, speaking to smiths and merchants, following threads that seemed to lead somewhere only to fray into nothing. Littlefinger's claim about losing the dagger to Tyrion Lannister in a bet hung over everything, a convenient explanation that felt too neat for the messy reality of assassination plots. Rodrik's instincts as a soldier told him something was profoundly wrong. The story did not fit together properly. Why would Tyrion Lannister, known for his cunning and love of books more than bloodshed, want to kill a child he had never met? Why use such a distinctive blade for a murder meant to look like an accident? Why hire a catspaw so incompetent he brought the murder weapon with him? Each question led to more questions, a maze with no clear center. But Lady Catelyn, driven by a mother's fear and Littlefinger's persuasive words, began to believe the Lannisters were behind the attempt on Bran's life. And if the Lannisters wanted her son dead, then her husband and daughters were in terrible danger in a capital city controlled by Queen Cersei and her father's gold. The decision to leave King's Landing came quickly. Rodrik and Lady Catelyn would return north, taking different routes to avoid attention. Ned would remain as hand, walking a tightrope between duty and danger. It was not a good plan, splitting the family further when threats gathered around them like wolves. But they were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, forced to react rather than act, always one step behind enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. Their path took them along the King's Road, that ancient highway connecting the Seven Kingdoms. They stopped at a crossroads inn, a place where travelers from all directions converged for food and rest before continuing their journeys. It was supposed to be anonymous, unmemorable, just another stop on a long road home. Then Tyrion Lannister walked through the door. The dwarf was traveling north from King's Landing, accompanied by a sellsword named Bronn and his own thoughts. He had no idea Lady Catelyn was in the inn, had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. He simply wanted a meal and perhaps some wine before continuing his journey. What happened next would echo through the realm like a bell-tolling war. Lady Catelyn revealed herself, called upon every Northerner and Riverlander in that inn to honor their oaths to House Stark and House Tully. And before Tyrion could fully understand what was happening, he found himself surrounded by armed men accused of attempting to murder Bran Stark, a prisoner being dragged off to face justice for a crime he swore he did not commit. Rodrik supported Lady Catelyn's decision because she was his lady and she had commanded it. But doubt gnawed at him. This was not how justice was supposed to work. This was not a trial or a careful investigation. This was desperation wrapped in authority, a powerful woman using her family's name to seize a man based on another man's testimony. The soldier in Rodrik understood that desperate measures sometimes became necessary. The honorable man in him wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. They took Tyrion to the Vale of Arryn, to Lady Catelyn's sister Lysa. The journey was hard and dangerous, through mountain passes where the ground fell away into nothing, and one misstep meant death. Tyrion complained constantly, as was his nature, but he also watched everything with those mismatched eyes, calculating odds, looking for opportunities. Rodrik watched him in return and saw not a murderer but a survivor, clever and scared in equal measure. The Eyrie rose above them like something from a nightmare, a pale castle perched on a mountain so high that men could barely breathe in its thin air. It was considered impregnable, impossible to assault, with only one narrow path leading to its gates. Rodrik, who understood siegecraft and warfare, recognized the strategic brilliance even as he hated the place on sight. There was something unnatural about a fortress that touched clouds. Lady Lysa Arryn greeted them in her throne room, sitting beside the moon door, that circular opening in the floor that dropped 600 feet to the valley below. She had changed since Rodrik last saw her, grown strange and brittle in her mountain fastness. Her son Robin, called Sweet Robin, clung to her skirts, despite being far too old for such behavior. The boy was weak and sickly, still nursing at his mother's breast when he should have been training with wooden swords. The madness in Lysa became apparent quickly. She was obsessed with protecting Robin from imagined threats, saw enemies in every shadow, trusted no one beyond her own twisted certainties. When Catelyn explained about Bran and the dagger, Lysa's eyes lit with vindictive pleasure. Of course the Lannisters were guilty. Of course they deserved punishment. She would throw Tyrion through the moon door herself if Catelyn wished it. But Tyrion, clever as a serpent, invoked his right to trial by combat. It was an ancient custom, recognized throughout the Seven Kingdoms. If he could find a champion to fight for him, and that champion won, the gods themselves would declare his innocence. Lysa agreed with the confidence of someone who knew her own knight. Serivardis again was one of the finest warriors in the Vale. Then Bronn the Sellsword stepped forward, said he would fight for Tyrion, not out of loyalty or friendship, but for gold promised and the simple pleasure of combat. Rodrik, who had trained warriors for decades, sized up both fighters with a professional's eye. Serivardis was skilled and experienced, armored heavily, fighting in the traditional knightly style. Bronn was quick and pragmatic, lightly armored, unburdened by notions of honor or fair play. The fight itself was brutal and one-sided, though not in the way anyone expected. Bronn used the terrain, the altitude, Vardis's heavy armor against him. He danced and dodged, making the knight chase him, wearing him down in the thin mountain air. And when Vardis was exhausted, when he could barely lift his sword, Bronn killed him with swift efficiency and sent him tumbling through the moon door. Tyrion was free, declared innocent by the gods, and Rodrik, watching it all unfold, felt the weight of failure settle on his shoulders. They had come to the Vale seeking justice, and found only chaos. Whatever plot surrounded House Stark, capturing Tyrion had not unraveled it. If anything, they had made everything worse. The journey home would be long and full of dark thoughts. War was coming. Rodrik could feel it the way old soldiers felt storms gathering on distant horizons. And House Stark stood at the center of it, surrounded by enemies they could not yet name. The news came by Raven, black wings carrying black tidings. Eddard Stark was dead, executed in King's Landing on charges of treason, beheaded on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor while his daughters watched and the mob cheered. The hand of the king, the Lord of Winterfell, the Warden of the North, murdered by a boy king who understood nothing of mercy or the cost of such actions. Rodrik was in the training yard when Maester Luwin brought him the message. He read it once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change the words written on that scrap of parchment. But the truth remained unchanged. Ned Stark was gone, killed by the same people he had tried to serve, by the same throne Robert Baratheon had won through rebellion. The irony tasted like ashes. The North exploded in fury. Every house, every hold, every keep from the wall to the neck called their banners and marched south, seeking vengeance. Robb Stark, barely more than a boy, despite all his training, found himself commanding armies before he had fully learned how to lead men. The young wolf became a king, crowned not by priests or tradition, but by his bannermen's love and their shared rage. The North would have justice for Ned Stark, or they would have blood. Preferably both. Rodrik watched from Winterfell as the armies marched away. Robb led them, his mother beside him, thousands of northern men ready to die for their murdered lord. And Winterfell, for the first time in living memory, stood nearly empty. The garrison that normally numbered in the hundreds dwindled to a skeleton crew. old men, green boys barely old enough to hold a sword, injured soldiers recovering from earlier conflicts. This was all that remained to defend the greatest castle in the north. Bran, still broken from his fall, became acting Lord of Winterfell with Maester Luwin to guide him and Rodrik to protect him. The responsibility weighed heavily on the crippled boy who should have been playing at swords in the training yard instead of making decisions about food stores and winter preparations. But Bran carried the Stark name and the Stark strength, meeting his duties with a courage that made Rodrik's chest tight with pride and sorrow in equal measure. The days fell into new patterns shaped by absence. Rodrik organized what defenses remained, training new recruits who would never be ready in time if real threats came calling. He managed patrols along Winterfell's borders, stretching thin resources across territories too vast to properly cover. He dealt with refugees fleeing the war in the south, people whose lords had marched away, leaving them unprotected. The work never ended, and there were never enough hands to do it. Reports filtered north about Robb's campaign. The young wolf was winning battles, outmaneuvering Lannister forces, proving himself a tactical genius despite his youth. Pride warred with worry in Rodrik's heart. This was the boy he had trained, the student who had absorbed every lesson and applied them with brilliance. But war had a way of devouring even the most talented commanders, and Robb was fighting enemies who played by different rules than Northern honor allowed. Then came news from the west. Ironborn longships raiding the coasts, villages burned, people taken as thralls or killed outright. Balon Greyjoy, who had bent the knee to Robert Baratheon after his own failed rebellion, had declared himself king of the Iron Islands once more. While the realm tore itself apart fighting over the Iron Throne, he would take what he could from a north stripped of defenders. The cruelest cut came not from the raids themselves, but from who led them. The Fawn Greyjoy, who had been Ned Stark's ward for a decade, who had grown up in Winterfell, who Rodrik himself had trained alongside Robb and Jon, had returned to his true family. He had abandoned the Starks for his father's approval, trading years of brotherhood for Ironborn salt and iron. Rodrik felt the betrayal like a blade between his ribs. He had watched that boy grow, had corrected his sword forms, had tried to instill honor and loyalty into someone who now used everything he learned at Winterfell to attack it. The training Rodrik gave him, meant to make him a better man, had instead equipped him to become a more effective traitor. The Ironborn struck all along the western coast, seizing territories left defenseless by Robb's march south. Rodrik gathered what men he could, every soldier capable of holding a sword, and rode west to meet the threat. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fighting raiders who struck like lightning and vanished before proper resistance could form. But Rodrik was determined to protect northern soil even if it cost him everything. While he fought Ironborn reavers along rocky coastlines and through burned villages, while he tried to rally scattered northern forces into something resembling an army, disaster struck at home. Theon took Winterfell. The news reached Rodrik like a thunderbolt. Theon had sailed to the castle with a small force of raiders, no more than 20 men. He scaled the walls he had climbed as a boy, walls he knew better than anyone, except perhaps Bran. He took the castle through surprise and insider knowledge, seizing it before anyone understood what was happening. By the time the garrison realized they were under attack, Ironborn warriors controlled the gates, and Theon held Bran and Rickon hostage. Rodrik's failure crushed him. He had been drawn away by raiding parties, while Theon struck at Winterfell's heart. The ancient seat of House Stark, 8,000 years of northern history, had fallen to a boy Rodrik himself had trained. The bitter irony was not lost on him. Every lesson he taught Theon, every tactic he explained, every weakness in Winterfell's defenses he accidentally revealed during training, all of it had been used against the very house he served. There was no time for self-recrimination. No time to process the enormity of the betrayal. Rodrik immediately began gathering his scattered forces, calling in every favor, summoning every able-bodied man within reach. The north was nearly defenseless, but he would muster an army somehow. He would march on Winterfell. He would free Bran and Rickon. He would make Theon Greyjoy understand exactly what happened to those who broke faith with House Stark. The march back to Winterfell consumed days that felt like years. Rodrik's force grew as they traveled, northern houses sending what men they could spare. It was not the army the situation deserved, not the thousands that should have been available to defend the castle, but it would have to be enough. Roughly 2,000 men rallied to Rodrik's banner, their faces grim, their hearts burning with rage at Ironborn treachery. As they drew closer to Winterfell, as familiar landmarks appeared on the horizon, Rodrik felt the weight of his age pressing down harder than ever before. He was an old man riding to war against a boy he had once thought to shape into something honorable. The world had turned upside down, and the training yard's simple certainties had given way to nightmare complexities, where former students became enemies and defense of home required attacking its walls. But duty called, loyalty demanded, and Rodrik Cassel, Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, would answer that call even if it killed him. He rode toward his last battle, though he did not yet know it. The army Rodrik assembled was not the force Winterfell deserved, but it was the force the North could spare, roughly 2,000 men, drawn from keeps and holdfasts scattered across territories too vast to defend properly. Some were veterans who remembered Robert's rebellion. Most were farmers and craftsmen who had picked up swords only when their lords commanded it. They were not the elite warriors who had marched south with Robber. They were what remained when the best had already gone to war. But they were northern men, and they understood what it meant when Winterfell fell. The ancient seat of House Stark, 8,000 years of history, now held by Ironborn raiders, led by a turncoat who had eaten northern bread and betrayed northern trust. Every man in that army carried personal fury alongside his weapon. This was not just about military strategy or territorial control. This was about making Theon Greyjoy understand that some betrayals earned consequences written in blood. The march back to Winterfell consumed days that felt endless. Rodrik pushed them hard, knowing that every hour's delay gave Theon time to fortify his position or call for reinforcements from the Iron Islands. Speed mattered more than perfect preparation. They needed to retake the castle before the situation calcified into something that would require a proper siege lasting months. As they traveled, Rodrik's mind worked through tactical considerations refined by decades of experience. He knew Winterfell's layout better than his own face in a mirror. Every wall, every gate, every weakness, the hot springs that kept the castle warm, even in deepest winter. The crypts beneath where Stark kings slept in stone. The godswood where the heart tree watched with carved eyes. He had walked those spaces for so long that the castle existed as a map inside his head, perfect and complete. But that knowledge cut both ways. Theon had grown up in Winterfell too, had explored its secrets as a boy, had climbed walls and sneaked through passages. Everything Rodrik knew, Theon might know as well. The advantage of intimate familiarity belonged to both sides, which meant it belonged to neither. When Winterfell finally appeared on the horizon, familiar towers rising against grey northern skies, Rodrik felt something twist inside his chest. The castle looked unchanged from the outside, the same stones that had stood for millennia still standing, but Ironborn banners flew where the Stark direwolf should have been, a violation so profound it made his teeth ache. His forces surrounded the castle, cutting off escape routes and establishing siege positions. Rodrik's veterans organized the newer soldiers, teaching them the basics of siege warfare in hurried lessons. Maintain the perimeter, rotate watches, prevent anyone from slipping through your lines. These were simple concepts, but crucial ones. An effective siege required patience and discipline, qualities not always abundant in men who wanted immediate vengeance. Then came the confrontation at the gates. Rodrik rode forward under a parley flag, close enough to be heard, but far enough to avoid archers on the walls. And there, standing atop Winterfell's battlements like he had earned the right, was Theon Greyjoy. The boy looked different, older, harder, wearing the trappings of ironborn culture he had rejected for years. He had a kraken embroidered on his chest, where a direwolf should have been. His face carried the expression of someone trying desperately to convince himself he had made the right choice. Rodrik's voice, when he spoke, carried across the distance between them, amplified by stone walls and cold air. He demanded surrender, called on Theon to release Bran and Rickon unharmed, offered mercy if the castle was yielded immediately, before more blood was spilled over this madness. The Ton's response was defiance wrapped in bravado. He was Prince of Winterfell now. He had taken the castle through cunning and courage. The North would recognize ironborn strength, or they would all die trying to deny it. His words sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced them in a mirror, trying to make them sound more certain than he felt. The conversation that followed was painful in ways that had nothing to do with military threats. Rodrik spoke to his former student, trying to reach the boy he had trained, reminded him of the years spent in Winterfell's yards, of the brotherhood he had shared with Robb and Jon, of the honor he had been taught, even if he wore it like an ill-fitting coat. There was still time to end this, to step back from the abyss, to choose differently than his pride demanded. But Theon was too far gone, too committed to the path he had chosen. He had burned bridges behind him when he took Winterfell, had proven himself to his father and his people through this conquest. Going back now would mean admitting it was all a mistake, and young men fueled by desperation and insecurity rarely possess that kind of wisdom. The parley dissolved into threats and counter-threats. Theon swore he would defend Winterfell to the last man. Rodrik promised that the last man would be Theon himself, executed for treason against the house that had raised him. Both men understood that words had failed, that what came next would be decided by steel and blood. Then Theon played his cruelest card. He had bodies brought to the walls, two small figures, burned beyond recognition, displayed like trophies or warnings, and he claimed these charred remains were Bran and Rickon Stark, that when the boys tried to escape, he had been forced to execute them, that the young wolf's brothers were dead, and Winterfell's hope died with them. The shock hit Rodrik like a physical blow. Those boys, the children he had trained and protected, reduced to burned meat and displayed like conquered enemies. Bran, who had climbed every wall in Winterfell with fearless joy. Rickon, barely more than a baby, who should have been playing in courtyards instead of running for his life. Dead, murdered by someone who had shared their table, their home, their lives. Rage followed the shock, hot and consuming. The kind of fury that made men do stupid things in battle, that overrode training and experience with simple animal need for revenge. Rodrik felt it burning through him, demanding action, screaming for Theon's blood. But underneath the rage lived something worse. Guilt. He had failed. Left Winterfell to fight raiders while Theon struck at its heart. Failed to protect the children Lord Eddard had entrusted to his care. Failed as master-at-arms, as guardian, as the man who was supposed to keep the Stark family safe when their father could not. The funeral pyres he imagined for Bran and Rickon burned inside his mind. 2 more Starks lost to betrayal and violence. 2 more failures added to a ledger already too heavy to bear. If he survived this siege, if he somehow managed to retake Winterfell and execute Tyon, would it matter? The children were gone. The castle was violated. Everything he had sworn to protect had been taken from him while he was looking the wrong direction. The siege began in earnest. After that terrible revelation, Rodrik's forces surrounded Winterfell completely, cutting off supplies and any hope of reinforcement. They could not assault the walls directly without massive casualties, casualties they could not afford when the north was already bleeding from multiple wounds. So they settled in for a waiting game, pressure slowly building like a storm gathering strength. Days passed in tense standoff. Theon's ironborn garrison grew restless, understanding they were trapped in a castle whose people hated them, surrounded by an army that wanted them dead. Rodrik maintained the siege with grim determination, planning the final assault, calculating the cost in lives it would take to breach those familiar walls. Inside his command tent at night, alone with thoughts that gave no comfort, Rodrik mourned children he believed dead and prepared himself for the battle that would end this. One way or another, Theon Greyjoy would answer for his crimes. One way or another, Winterfell would be reclaimed. Or Rodrik would die trying. The old warrior sharpened his sword in the dark, thinking about duty and loyalty, and the bitter price of both. Thinking about Martin, who died at the Tower of Joy so many years ago. Thinking about Ned, who died in King's Landing, on a traitor's charge, despite a lifetime of honor. Thinking about Bran and Rickon, their short lives ended by someone who should have protected them. House Cassel had always served House Stark unto death. Rodrik would not break that tradition now, no matter what came next. The siege continued. And in the distance, unknown to the besiegers and the besieged alike, reinforcements approached under banners that should have meant salvation, but instead carried doom. The siege settled into patterns that both sides understood, but neither wanted. Days blurred together in a rhythm of watches and waiting, of maintaining pressure without committing to the bloodbath that storming Winterfell's walls would require. Rodrik rotated his men through duty shifts, making sure everyone stayed sharp despite the tedium. Sieges were won not through dramatic charges but through patience and the slow grinding down of enemy morale. Inside Winterfell, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The Ironborn garrison numbered perhaps 50 men, enough to hold walls against a hasty assault, but nowhere near enough to break a siege or defend every section of the massive castle simultaneously. They were raiders, not soldiers trained for prolonged defensive warfare. The castle's supplies would last for months under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. Theon's occupation had not prepared for siege conditions. Food began running low faster than it should have. Worse than the supplies was the morale problem. The people of Winterfell, servants and small folk who had lived there for generations, despised their ironborn occupiers. They resisted in small ways, moved slowly when given orders, claimed ignorance about castle layout when asked questions, made life difficult in 1,000 petty ways that added up to serious obstacles. Theon had conquered the castle, but he did not control it. The stones themselves seemed to reject him. The Ironborn grew nervous as the siege dragged on. They were far from the sea, trapped in a landlocked castle, surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead. No reinforcements were coming from the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy had other priorities, other targets. His son's conquest of Winterfell was supposed to be a quick raid, a symbolic victory, not a prolonged occupation requiring military support his stretched forces could not provide. Theon's position became increasingly desperate. He executed Mickon the blacksmith for defiance, hanging the man's body from the walls as a warning. But violence only hardened resistance. Every Ironborn atrocity made the Northern Army outside more determined and the castle's people more willing to risk rebellion. Theon had painted himself into a corner, and everyone recognized it, except perhaps the boy himself. Rodrik watched this deterioration with professional assessment. Time worked in his favor. Winterfell's stores would run out eventually. The garrison would grow more fractious. Mistakes would be made. The castle would fall without requiring a costly assault if he could just maintain pressure long enough. But patience warred with urgency. Every day the siege continued was another day. Winterfell suffered under occupation. Another day those ancient stones wore Ironborn banners. Another day, Theon Greyjoy breathed free air instead of choking on a noose. Rodrik felt the tension between strategic wisdom and emotional need, between what should be done and what he wanted to do. He maintained discipline through force of will and decades of experience commanding men, kept the younger soldiers from attempting foolish heroics, prevented hotheads from charging the gates in fits of rage, reminded everyone that dead heroes could not retake castles, that victory required surviving long enough to achieve it. The psychological warfare continued. Rodrik had his men call out to the Ironborn on the walls, reminding them they were doomed, offering surrender terms that grew less generous with each passing day. Theon responded with defiant speeches that rang increasingly hollow. The boy was cracking under pressure, anyone could see it. He had expected glory and found only isolation, had wanted his father's approval, and received abandonment, was learning the hard way that conquering and holding were two entirely different challenges. Then salvation appeared on the horizon, or what looked like salvation. A force approaching from the east under northern banners, roughly 600 men, well armed and organized, moving with the confidence of professional soldiers rather than hastily assembled militia. At their head rode a young man who introduced himself as Ramsay Snow, bastard son of Lord Roose Bolton. The news spread through Rodrik's camp like wildfire. Reinforcements from the Dreadfort, Bolton troops sent to help lift the siege, additional men who would make storming Winterfell's walls feasible without catastrophic losses. It seemed too good to be true. A gift from the gods at exactly the moment it was needed most. Rodrik received Ramsay cautiously at first, old warrior's instincts making him suspicious of convenient coincidences, but the young man's credentials checked out. Bolton forces had been fighting in the south with Robb, but Lord Rodds had sent his bastard son north to deal with the Ironborn threat. The story made sense. The banners were correct. Everything appeared legitimate. Ramsay himself was disturbing in ways Rodrik could not quite articulate. Too friendly, too eager to help, smiling at inappropriate moments. But the North bred strange men sometimes, and bastards often carried chips on their shoulders that manifested in peculiar ways. Rodrik told himself he was being paranoid, seeing threats where none existed because recent betrayals had made him suspicious of everyone. The Bolton forces integrated into the siege, taking positions around Winterfell's perimeter. Ramsay proved knowledgeable about military matters, offering suggestions about assault strategies, about weak points in the castle's defenses. He deferred to Rodrik's command appropriately, showing respect for the older man's experience and position. On the surface, everything proceeded exactly as it should. But something felt wrong to Rodrik, an itch he could not scratch, a warning he could not quite hear. He had fought in wars for decades, had developed instincts about danger that operated below conscious thought, and those instincts whispered that Ramsay Snow was not what he appeared to be. The younger soldiers did not share his concerns. They were thrilled to have reinforcements, eager to finally assault Winterfell and end this siege. The addition of Bolton troops had shifted the odds dramatically in their favor. Victory was within reach now, close enough to taste. Plans were made for the final assault. Ramsay suggested attacking at dawn, using the Boltons' expertise in siege warfare to breach the gates while Rodrik's larger force drew defenders to the walls. It was a sound strategy, the kind that should work if executed properly. Rodrik found himself agreeing despite his unease, recognizing that victory required accepting help even from sources that made his skin crawl. The night before the planned assault, Rodrik walked through the camp, checking on his men, making sure everyone understood their roles for the coming battle. The soldiers were confident, joking about what they would do to Theon once they captured him, making plans for the celebration after Winterfell fell. Rodrik did not share their confidence, could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But he had no concrete evidence, no specific reason to delay the assault beyond old warrior's intuition that had saved his life before, but might also be nothing more than paranoia born from too many betrayals. He returned to his tent and tried to sleep. Failed. Lay awake staring at canvas above him, listening to the camp around him settle into pre-battle quiet. Tomorrow they would retake Winterfell, or die trying. Tomorrow Theon would answer for his crimes. Tomorrow the siege would end one way or another. Rodrik thought about Bran and Rickon, their burned bodies displayed on Winterfell's walls. Thought about Ned, executed in King's Landing. Thought about Martin dying at the Tower of Joy. The Cassels and the Starks bound together across generations by loyalty and shared blood. So many deaths, so much loss, and tomorrow would bring more. But if his death brought back Winterfell, if it restored House Stark to their ancestral home, then it would be a worthy end for a life spent in service. Better to die fighting for something that mattered than to survive by abandoning duty. The old warrior finally drifted into uneasy sleep, his hand resting on his sword hilt out of long habit. In a few hours, the sun would rise on his last battle, but he did not know that yet, did not understand that the greatest betrayal was not behind him, but waiting with the dawn. The camp slept. Ramsay Snow smiled in the darkness, and fate turned its wheel toward tragedy. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of northern morning that promised nothing but hardship. Rodrik woke before first light, as he had for decades, his body trained to rise when warriors needed to prepare. He armed himself carefully, checking every strap and buckle, making certain his sword was sharp and his armor secure. These were rituals performed thousands of times, muscle memory and routine providing comfort against the chaos that battle would bring. The camp stirred around him as men prepared for the assault. Veterans moved with quiet efficiency, their preparations economical and practiced. Younger soldiers betrayed nervousness through hurried movements and too loud conversations. Rodrik walked among them, offering words of encouragement, making small corrections to equipment, being present in the way that good commanders understood mattered more than speeches. The Bolton forces were already positioned, Ramsay having roused his men even earlier than Rodrik's. They stood in formation, weapons ready, looking every inch the professional soldiers they claimed to be. Ramsay approached Rodrik with his unsettling smile, confirming the assault plan, reviewing the signals that would coordinate their attack. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. Rodrik gave the signal to advance. His forces began moving toward Winterfell's walls in organized groups, shields raised against expected arrows, siege ladders carried by teams of men. The operation unfolded exactly as planned, each unit knowing its role, everyone committed to the same goal. This was the moment months of siege had been building toward. Then the world turned upside down. The Bolton forces attacked, not Winterfell, Rodrik's own men. It happened so fast that understanding lagged behind reality. One moment the Boltons were allies positioned to support the assault. The next moment they were enemies, blades drawn, cutting into northern soldiers from behind. The surprise was total and devastating. Men died not knowing why their supposed comrades had turned on them, confusion and shock robbing them of the ability to properly defend themselves. Rodrik's mind struggled to process the betrayal even as his warrior's instincts took over. This was not a mistake or miscommunication. This was planned treachery. Ramsay Snow had never intended to help retake Winterfell. He had come to destroy the force trying to reclaim it. The battle descended into chaos. Rodrik's men tried to reorganize, to fight back against enemies who were supposed to be allies. But they were caught in the worst possible position, committed to assaulting Winterfell while being slaughtered from behind. Every tactical advantage they held evaporated in seconds. The siege that should have ended in victory became a massacre instead. Rodrik fought like a man possessed, decades of skill and experience keeping him alive when younger soldiers fell around him. His sword found Bolton flesh again and again, each strike precise and deadly. He screamed orders, trying to rally his forces into something that could fight back effectively. Some men heard him and fought harder. Most simply died. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade could reach. These were Northerners killing Northerners. House Bolton, sworn to House Stark for generations, butchering loyalist forces. Ramsay Snow grinning like this was sport rather than murder. The old certainties Rodrik had built his life around crumbled. If northern houses could not trust each other, if oaths meant nothing, if loyalty was just a word used to disguise ambition, then what had any of it meant? He thought of Martin dying at the Tower of Joy for Lord Eddard, of decades spent training Stark children and defending Stark lands, of the Cassel family's generations of faithful service, all of it rendered meaningless by the realization that honor was a lie people told themselves while sharpening knives for each other's backs. The battle was lost. Rodrik understood that with crushing finality, too many of his men were already dead. The survivors were scattered and demoralized. Winterfell's gates remained closed, Theon content to let the Boltons do his work for him. There was no victory to be salvaged here, no heroic last stand that would turn the tide. There was only death coming fast on red-stained steel. Bolton's soldiers surrounded him. He fought them magnificently, his sword a blur of motion, his technique perfect despite exhaustion and age. Every lesson he had ever learned in combat, every skill honed across decades of warfare, manifested in those final moments. He was master-at-arms of Winterfell, and he would show these traitors what that title meant. But numbers and youth eventually overcome skill and experience. A blow from behind that he could not dodge. A blade through his guard that he could not quite deflect. Pain blossomed across his body as he went down, overwhelmed but unbroken. They took him alive, which somehow felt worse than dying with sword in hand. Ramsay ordered him bound and brought into Winterfell. The gates opened for the Boltons, and Rodrik was dragged through them into the castle he had spent his life protecting. The irony was almost too bitter to process. He had come to retake Winterfell from traitors, and now traitors were delivering him to traitors through Winterfell's own gates. The courtyard felt profoundly wrong. This space where he had trained generations of warriors, where wooden swords had clacked and boys had learned to become men, now served as stage for his execution. The people of Winterfell were forced to watch, their faces reflecting horror and helpless rage. Maester Luwin stood among them, tears streaming down the old scholar's face. And there, trying to look commanding but mostly looking terrified, stood Theon Greyjoy. The student faced his teacher across blood-stained stones. Theon's eyes would not meet Rodrik's directly, sliding away whenever their gazes threatened to connect. Guilt and pride warred across his features. He had not expected this, had not planned for Rodrik to be captured alive, had probably hoped the old man would die cleanly in battle rather than force this confrontation. Rodrik was dragged forward and forced to his knees. His hands were bound behind him. Blood seeped from wounds across his body, but he did not beg, did not plead, did not offer any of the things a condemned man might offer in hopes of mercy. Instead, he spoke, not loud or dramatic, just the simple words of a man who had nothing left to lose and truths that needed saying. He told Theon that he was lost, that by taking Winterfell and murdering the Stark boys, he had destroyed whatever small chance remained of finding his way back to honor, that the Greyjoys would never accept him now that he had failed so completely that the Starks would never forgive him, that he had made himself an orphan belonging nowhere, trusted by no one, destined for a miserable end that he richly deserved. Gods help you, Theon Greyjoy. Now you are truly lost. The words hit harder than any blade. Theon flinched like he had been struck. tried to recover his composure, failed. His voice, when he ordered the execution, came out strangled and uncertain. Theon drew his sword, approached Rodrik, raised the blade, and in that moment the teacher taught one final lesson, not through words, but through bearing, through the dignity of facing death without fear, through the quiet courage that allowed a man to kneel in mud with his life measured in heartbeats and still maintain his humanity. The blade came down. Once badly aimed, Rodrik jerked, but did not cry out. The Theon raised the sword again, brought it down. The stroke lacked force and conviction. Rodrik's body shuddered. A third time, a fourth, each blow increasingly desperate, increasingly terrible. Theon was not a killer. For all his raiders' boasts, he had never executed anyone, did not know how. His incompetence with the blade turned what should have been a clean death into butchery. The people of Winterfell watched in horror. Some turned away, others wept openly. Maester Luwin's prayers could be heard above the terrible sounds of steel against flesh and bone. Finally, after what felt like forever, it was done. Sir Rodrik Cassel, Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, lay dead in the courtyard he had commanded for decades. His blood stained the same stones where he had taught children to hold swords. His unseeing eyes reflected the grey sky above, cold and indifferent to the tragedy below. The student had killed his teacher, but he had failed even in that, his incompetence making the act more horrible than it needed to be. And the lesson Rodrik taught with his death, the quiet courage of his final moments, would haunt Theon Greyjoy for the rest of his twisted life. Ramsay Snow smiled. He had delivered exactly what Roose Bolton wanted. The northern forces loyal to House Stark had been decimated. Winterfell was secured under Bolton control, masquerading as support for the Ironborn. The north was that much weaker, that much easier for the Boltons to manipulate and eventually dominate. The body was left where it fell, as a warning to anyone who might consider resistance. The House Castle's long service to House Stark ended in mud and blood and betrayal. The Age of Honor died with Rodrik in that courtyard. And Winterfell, ancient seat of power and justice, bore silent witness to atrocity committed on its stones. The cruelest truths often arrive too late to matter. Days after Rodrik's execution, after his blood had soaked into Winterfell's courtyard, stones and his body had been disposed of like refuse, the reality of what Theon had done became clear to those who survived. Bran and Rickon Stark were not dead. The burned bodies displayed on the walls had been two millers' boys, killed to maintain the fiction of Theon's control. Osha, the wildling woman who served the Starks, had spirited the real princes away through Winterfell's crypts, using passages and secrets that Theon in all his years had never discovered. Rodrik died believing he had failed to protect those children, died carrying guilt for deaths that never happened, died thinking the Stark line had been broken by his negligence. The tragedy of this timing, the bitter cosmic joke of it, was almost too painful to contemplate. If he had known, if he had just known that Bran and Rickon lived, would it have changed anything? Would he have approached the siege differently? Would he have survived? Probably not. The Bolton betrayal would have come regardless. But he might have died with different thoughts in his final moments. Might have faced execution knowing his failure was not as complete as it seemed. Small comfort perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. Instead, he went to his death believing the worst, carrying a burden of guilt that was not entirely earned. The loss of Rodrik Cassel rippled through the north in ways that would only become clear with time. He had been one of the last experienced military commanders remaining when Robb marched south. His death left a void in northern leadership that could not be easily filled. The men he might have trained, the strategies he might have implemented, the wisdom he might have shared, all gone. The north grew that much weaker, that much more vulnerable to enemies both foreign and domestic. But perhaps more significant than the tactical loss was what his death represented. The execution of Winterfell's master-at-arms by a Greyjoy turncoat, enabled by Bolton treachery, performed in the courtyard he had commanded for decades. This was a symbol of everything wrong in Westeros. Honor had become liability. Loyalty earned betrayal. Service was rewarded with death. The old codes that men like Rodrik lived by were revealed as outdated fantasies in a world that ran on ambition and cruelty. The warriors Rodrik trained carried his legacy forward, even when they did not realize it. Robb Stark, commanding armies in the Riverlands, used tactics and strategies absorbed through years in Winterfell's training yards. Jon Snow at the Wall drew on lessons learned under Rodrik's stern tutelage when training Night's Watch recruits. Even Theon, monster though he had become, fought with techniques Rodrik taught him. The Master-at-Arms left his mark on a generation of fighters who would shape the wars to come. For Theon Greyjoy, Rodrik's ghost became an unwelcome constant companion. The execution haunted him immediately and completely. In Winterfell, he saw Rodrik's face in shadows, heard his voice in wind through the courtyard, felt the weight of those final words pressing down like stones on his chest. Gods help you, Theon Greyjoy. Now you are truly lost. The prophecy proved accurate with terrible precision. When Ramsay Bolton truly revealed himself and took Theon prisoner, when the torture began and Theon was broken down into the creature called Reek, Rodrik's execution replayed in his mind constantly. The memories mixed with present horrors, the clumsy beheading he had performed becoming one more crime in a list too long to fully catalogue. During the worst moments in the Dreadfort's dungeons, Theon would sometimes imagine Rodrik standing in the corner, watching silently, neither condemning nor forgiving but simply bearing witness. The guilt never left. Even years later, after Theon's attempted redemption, after he helped Sansa escape and tried to make amends for some fraction of his crimes, Rodrik's death remained one of the weights he carried. You could argue that Theon's later arc, his desperate attempts to reclaim some shred of honor, were partially driven by the memory of the man he had killed. The teacher whose final lesson was teaching Theon exactly what he had become. The Stark children learned of Rodrik's death in scattered ways, each processing the loss through their own lens of trauma and displacement. Bran, hiding in crypts beneath Winterfell with Rickon, heard Rodrik die. The sounds echoed down through stone, a nightmare made real. When he eventually learned the execution had been meant to avenge him and his brother, that Rodrik had died trying to save them, the guilt was almost unbearable for a child already carrying too much. Jon Snow received the news at Cassel Black, another name added to the ever-growing list of people he had loved who were gone. He remembered training sessions in Winterfell's yard, Rodrik's gruff corrections and rare praise, the feeling of being treated fairly despite his bastard status. The wall seemed colder after that, though perhaps it was just Jon growing colder inside. Robb, king in the north, commanding armies and winning battles, felt the loss of Rodrik as both personal and strategic. Another mentor gone, another link to the Winterfell he remembered severed. Another reminder that the home he was fighting to protect was already destroyed in all the ways that truly mattered. Even Sansa and Arya, far from home and fighting their own battles, mourned the Master-at-Arms when they eventually learned his fate. He had been part of the stable world of their childhood, a constant presence that seemed as permanent as Winterfell's walls. Learning he was gone reinforced what they already knew, but kept trying to deny. That world was dead. They could never go back. House Cassel's story ended with Rodrik's death. His brother Martin had died at the Tower of Joy. His nephew Jory had been killed in King's Landing when Ned Stark's men were slaughtered. 3 generations of Cassel men, all dead in service to House Stark, leaving no heirs to continue the line. It was complete sacrifice in the most literal sense. A family that gave everything and ceased to exist because of it. The symbolism resonated through northern culture. The castles represented the best of what bound lesser houses to greater ones. Not fear or calculation, but genuine devotion. Not service given grudgingly, but loyalty offered freely. Their extinction became a cautionary tale and a tragedy, proof that the old ways led only to graves. Yet, in another sense, the castles achieved a kind of immortality. Their names were remembered, their sacrifice honored. Songs were sung in northern halls about the faithful servants who stood by the Starks through rebellion and ruin. House Cassel died, but its legacy lived on in the stories people told their children about what loyalty truly meant. Rodrik Cassel never sought glory or recognition. He wanted only to serve faithfully, to do his duty to protect the people and place he loved. By those measures he succeeded completely. He trained warriors who changed the world. He stood watch when others ran. He died trying to save the children of the house he served. That his death achieved nothing, that the castle fell anyway, that the children he died for were never actually in danger from the threat he imagined. These ironies do not diminish what he did. They just make his story more human, more real, more tragic. In the great Game of Thrones, in the struggle for power and crowns and iron seats, people like Rodrik Cassel are casualties. Collateral damage in conflicts they did not start and could not control. Their deaths are footnotes in histories written by victors who barely remember their names. But for those who knew him, for the students he trained and the castle he protected, for everyone who understood what his life represented, Rodrik Cassel was no footnote. He was the heart of old Winterfell, the embodiment of northern values, the faithful servant who never wavered, even when faith itself became foolishness. The Game of Thrones needed more people like Rodrik Cassel. Instead, it killed the ones it had and called their deaths necessary, called their loyalty naive, called their honor outdated. Perhaps that is why the realm burned, why the wars consumed everything, why so much was lost and so little gained. Because the Rodriks of the world, the steady hands and loyal hearts, were destroyed by the Ramsays and the Theons and the ambitious players who saw honor only as weakness to exploit. Sir Rodrik Cassel, Master-at-Arms of Winterfell, deserved better than he got. But then, most heroes do. His story reminds us that in worlds built on betrayal, the faithful die first, and their deaths matter more than all the crowns and thrones combined. If you have found value in this exploration of an underappreciated character, if Rodrik's story has resonated with you, please consider subscribing. These deep dives into the lives of supporting characters who made Game of Thrones so rich are only possible because people like you want to hear them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for honoring the Rodriks of the world who serve without seeking glory and die without receiving justice. The North remembers, and so should we all.